Chapter 5. For 2 days, at an ever-accelerating pace, we walked up and down hills without rest. Apprehensively, I watched Milagro's silent figure slip in and out of the shadows. The urgency of his movements only intensified my feelings of uncertainty. There were moments when I felt like screaming at him to take me back to the mission. The afternoon closed over the forest as the clouds turned from white to gray to black. Heavy and oppressive, they hovered over the treetops. A deafening roar of thunder broke the stillness. Water came down in sheets, tearing at branches and leaves with relentless fury. Motioning me to take cover under the gigantic leaves he had cut, Milagros squatted on the ground. Instead of joining him, I took off my knapsack, untied the gourd filled with Angelica's powdered bones from around my waist, and pulled off my t-shirt. Warm and soothing, the water beat against my aching body, lathering first my head, then my body with shampoo. I washed away the ashes, the smell of death from my skin. I turned to look at Milagros. His blackened face was drawn with fatigue. His eyes held such sadness that I regretted having cleaned myself in such haste. Nervously, I began to wash my t-shirt, and without looking at him asked, "Are we almost to the settlement?" I was certain we had walked well over 100 miles since leaving the mission. "We will be there tomorrow," Milagros said, unwrapping a small bundle of roasted meat held together with lianas and leaves. A peculiar smile lifted the corners of his mouth and deepened the wrinkles around his slanted eyes. "That is, if we walk at my pace." The rain thinned, the clouds dispersed. I breathed deeply, filling my lungs with the clear, fresh air. Drops continued to trickle from the leaves long after the rain abated. As they caught the reflection of the sun, they glittered with the dazzling intensity of bits of broken glass. "I hear someone coming," Milagros whispered. "Stay still." I heard nothing, not even the call of a bird or the rustling of leaves. I was about to say, "So when a branch cracked and a naked man appeared on the path in front of us." I was about to say so, when a branch cracked and a naked man appeared on the path in front of us. He was not much taller than myself, perhaps 5'4". I wondered if it was his muscular chest or his nakedness that made him seem so much bigger than me. He carried a long bow and several arrows. His face and body were covered with red serpentine lines that extended all the way down the sides of his legs, ending in dots around his ankles. A short distance behind him, 2 naked young women stared at me. A frozen expression of surprise held their dark eyes wide open. Tufts of fibers seemed to grow from their ears. Match-like sticks stuck out from the corners of their mouths and lower lips. Fastened about their waists, upper arms, wrists, and below their knees were bands of red cotton string. Their dark hair was cut short, and like the man, they had a clean, wide-shaven tonsure on the crown. No one said a word, and out of sheer nervousness I shouted, "Shorinohe! Shorinohe!" Angelica had advised me that if I ever happened to meet Indians in the forest, I should greet them by shouting, "Good friend! Good friend!" "Aye, aye, 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 Shori," the man answered, moving closer. Red feathers adorned his ears. They were sticking out of 2 pieces of short cane, the size of my little finger, which were inserted through each lobe. He began to speak to Milagros, gesticulating a great deal, motioning with his hand or a nod of his head toward the path leading into the thicket. Repeatedly he raised one of his arms straight above his head, his fingers extended as if reaching for a ray of sunlight. I beckoned the women to come closer. Giggling, they hid behind bushes. When I saw the bananas in the baskets fastened to their backs, I opened my mouth wide and gestured with my hands that I wanted to eat one of them. Cautiously, the older of the 2 women approached, and without looking at me, she unfastened her basket, then broke the softest, yellowest banana from the bunch. In one swift motion, she removed the slender sticks from around her mouth, sank her teeth in the peel, bit along it, broke it open, then held the naked fruit in front of my face. It had an oddly triangular shape and was certainly the thickest banana I had ever seen. "Delicious," I said in Spanish, rubbing my stomach. It tasted very much like an ordinary banana, but left a heavy coating in my mouth. She gave me 2 more. As she was peeling the 4th, I tried to make her understand that I could not eat another. Grinning, she dropped the remaining fruit on the ground, then placed her hands on my stomach. They were calloused hands, yet the delicate, slender fingers were gentle as she hesitantly touched my breasts, shoulders, and face, as if she wanted to verify that I was real. She began to talk in a high-pitched nasal tone that reminded me of Angelica's voice. She pulled the elastic on my panties and called her companion to take a look. It was only then that I felt embarrassed. I tried to pull away. Laughing and squealing with delight, they embraced me, stroking the back and front of my body. Then they took my hand and guided it over their own faces and bodies. They were slightly shorter than I, yet they were massive. With their full breasts, protruding stomachs, and wide hips, they seemed to dwarf me. "They are from the Itti Kotteri village," Milagro said in Spanish, turning toward me. Etewa and his 2 wives, Ritimi and Tutemi, as well as other people from the settlement, have made camp for a few days at an old abandoned garden nearby. He reached for his bow and arrows, which he had left leaning against a tree trunk, and added, "We will travel with them." Meanwhile, the women had discovered my wet t-shirt. Enthralled, they rubbed it against their painted faces and bodies before I had a chance to slip it over my head. Stretched and streaked with red annatto paste, it hung on me like a dirty, oversized rice sack. I put the ash-filled gourd in my knapsack, and as I lifted it on my back, the women began to giggle uncontrollably. Itua came to stand next to me. He stared at me with his brown eyes. Then a wide grin lit his face as he ran his fingers through my hair. His finely chiseled nose and the gentle curve of his lips gave his round face an almost girlish appearance. "I will go with Itua to track down a tapir he spotted a while ago," Milagro said. "You walk with the women." For an instant, I could only stare at him in disbelief, but finally managed to utter, not knowing what else to say. I must have looked comical, for Milagros began to laugh. His slanted eyes all but disappeared between his forehead and his high cheekbones. He put one hand on my shoulder. He tried to look serious, but a flickering smile remained on his lips. "These are Angelica's and my people," he said, turning toward Itiwa and his two wives. "Ritimi is her grandniece. Angelica never saw her." I smiled at the two women. They nodded their heads as if they had understood Milagro's words. Milagro's and Itua's laughter echoed through the lianas, then died away as they reached the bamboo thicket bordering the path along the river. Ritimi took my hand and led me into the thicket. I walked between Ritimi and Tutemi. We moved silently in single file toward the abandoned gardens of the Itti Kotteri. I wondered whether it was because of the heavy load on their backs, or whether it gave their feet a better grip on the ground that they walked with their knees and toes pointing inward. Our shadows grew and diminished with the faint rays of sunlight filtering through the treetops. My ankles were weak from exhaustion. I moved clumsily, stumbling over branches and roots. Ritimi put her arm around my waist, but it made walking on the narrow path even more awkward. She pulled the knapsack from my back and stuffed it into Temi's basket. I was seized by an odd apprehension. I wanted to retrieve my knapsack, pull out the ash-filled gourd, and tie it around my waist. I had the vague notion of having severed some kind of a bond. Had I been asked to put my feelings into words, I would not have been able to do so. Yet I sensed that from that moment on, some of the magic and enchantment Angelica had transfused into me had vanished. The sun was already below the horizon of trees as we reached a clearing in the forest. Amidst all the other shades of green, I clearly distinguished the lighter, almost translucent green of the plantain fronds. Strung out on the edge of what once must have been a large garden were low, triangular-shaped huts arranged in a semicircle with their backs to the forest. The dwellings were open on all sides, except for the roofs, which were covered with several layers of broad banana leaves. As if someone had given a signal, we were instantly surrounded by open-mouthed, wide-eyed women and men. I held on to Ritimi's arm. Her having walked with me through the forest made her different from these gaping figures. Encircling me by the waist, she drew me close to her. The rapid, excited tone of her voice kept the crowd at bay for a moment longer. Suddenly their faces were only inches away from mine. Saliva dribbled down their chins, and their features were disfigured by the tobacco wads stuck between their gums and lower lips. I forgot all about the objectivity with which an anthropologist is to regard another culture. At the moment, these Indians were nothing more than a group of ugly, dirty people. I closed my eyes, only to open them the next instant as an unsteady, bony hand touched my cheeks. It was an old man. Grinning, he began to shout, "Ai, ai, ai, shori!" Echoing his shouts, everyone at once tried to embrace me, almost crushing me with joy. They managed to pull my t-shirt over my head. I felt their hands, lips, and tongues on my face and body. They smelled of smoke and earth. Their saliva, which clung to my skin, smelled of rotten tobacco leaves. Appalled, I burst into tears. With, with apprehensive expressions on their faces, they pulled away. Although I could not understand their words, their tone clearly revealed their bewilderment. Later that night, I learned from Milagros that Ritimi had explained to the group that she had found me in the forest. At first, she had believed I was a spirit and had been afraid to come near me. Only after she had seen me devour the bananas was she convinced I was human. For only humans eat that greedily. Between my hammock and Milagros burned a fire. Smoking and sputtering, it threw a faint light over the open hut, leaving the trees outside in one solid mass of darkness. It was a reddish light that combined with the smoke made my eyes water. People sat around the fire, so close to each other their shoulders touched. Their shadowed faces looked all the same to me. The red and black designs on their bodies seemed to have a life of their own as they moved and twisted with each gesture. Ritimi sat on the ground, her legs fully extended, her left arm resting against my hammock. Her skin was a soft, deep yellow in the wavering light. The painted lines on her face ran toward her temples, accentuating her Asiatic features. Clearly I could see the small holes, free of the sticks, at the corners of her mouth, lower lip, and the septum of her wide nostrils. Aware of my stare, she looked at me directly, her round face creasing into a smile. She had square, short teeth. They were strong and very white. I began to doze off to the gentle murmur of their voices, yet slept fitfully, wondering what Milagros was telling them as I kept waking to the sound of laughter. Part 2, Chapter 6. When do you think we'll be back? I asked Milagros 6 months later, handing him the letter I had written to Father Coriolano at the mission. In it, I briefly notified him that I intended to stay for at least 2 more months with the Itti Kotteri. I asked him to inform my friends in Caracas, and most important of all, I begged him to send, with Milagros, as many writing pads and pencils as he could spare. When will you be back? I asked again. In 2 weeks or so, Milagros said casually, fitting the letter into his bamboo quiver. He must have detected the anxiousness in my face, for he added, "There is no way to tell, but I'll be back." I watched as he started down the path leading to the river. He adjusted the quiver on his back, then turned to me briefly. His movements momentarily arrested, as though there was something he wished to say. Instead, he lifted his hand to wave goodbye. Slowly, I headed back to the Shabono, passing several men felling trees next to the garden. Carefully, I stepped around the logs cluttered all over the cleared patch, making sure not to cut my feet on the pieces of bark, chips, and slivers of wood buried amidst the dead leaves on the ground. He'll be back as soon as the plantains are ripe, Itti shouted, waving his hand the way Milagros had just done. He won't miss the feast. Smiling, I waved back, wanting to ask when the feast would take place. I did not need to. He had already given me the answer, when the plantains were ripe. The brush and logs that were scattered each night in front of the main entrance of the Shabono to keep out intruders had already been moved aside. It was still early, yet the huts facing the round, open clearing were mostly empty. Women and men were working in the nearby gardens or had gone into the forest to gather wild fruits, honey, and firewood. Armed with miniature bows and arrows, a group of little boys gathered around me. "See the lizard I killed?" Sisiwe said, holding the dead animal by the tail. "That's all he can do, shoot lizards," a boy in the group said mockingly, scratching his ankle with the toes of his other foot. "And most of the time he misses." "I don't," Sisiwe shouted, his face turning red with rage. I caressed the stubbles on the crown of his head. In the sunlight, his hair was not black, but a reddish brown. Searching for the right words from my limited vocabulary, I hoped to assure him that one day he would be the best hunter in the settlement. Sisiwe, Ritimi's and Ituwa's son, was 6, at the most 7, years old, for he had not yet wear a public waist string. Ritimi, believing that the sooner a boy tied his penis against his abdomen, the faster he would grow, had repeatedly forced the child to do so. But Sisiwe had refused, arguing that it hurt. Itiwe had not insisted. His son was growing healthy and strong. Soon the father had argued Sisiwe would realize that it was improper for a man to be seen without a waist string. Like most children, Sisiwe wore a piece of fragrant root tied around his neck, a charm against disease. And as soon as the designs on his body faded, he was painted anew with onoto. Smiling, his anger forgotten, Sisiwe held on to my hand, and in one swift motion climbed up on me as if I were a tree. He wrapped his legs around my waist. He swung backward and, stretching his arms toward the sky, shouted, "Look how blue it is, the color of your eyes." From the middle of the clearing, the sky seemed immense. There were no trees, lianas, or leaves to mar its splendor. The dense vegetation loomed outside the Shabono, beyond the palisades of logs protecting the settlement. The trees appeared to bide their time, as if they knew they were only provisionally held in check. Tugging at my arm, the children pulled me together with Sisiwe to the ground. At first, I had not been able to associate them with any particular parent, for they wandered in and out of the huts, eating and sleeping wherever it was convenient. I only knew where the babies belonged, for they were perennially hanging around their mothers' bodies. Whether it was day or night, the infants never seemed disturbed, regardless of what activity their mothers were engaged in. I wondered how I would do without Milagros. Each day he had spent several hours teaching me the language, customs, and beliefs of his people, which are eagerly recorded in my notepads. Learning who was who among the Itti Kotteri proved to be most confusing. They never called each other by name, except when someone was to be insulted. Ritimi and Ituwa were known as mother and father of Sisiwe and Teshoma. It was permissible to use children's names, but as soon as they reached puberty, everyone refrained from it. Matters were further complicated in that males and females from a given lineage called each other brother and sister. Males and females from another lineage were referred to as brother-in-law and sister-in-law. A male who married a woman from an eligible lineage called all the women of that lineage wives, but did not have sexual contact with them. Milagros often pointed out that it was not only I who had to adapt. The Itti Kotteri were just as baffled by my odd behavior. To them, I was neither woman, man, nor child. And as such, they did not quite know what to think of me or where they could fit me in. Old Hayama emerged from her hut. In a high-pitched voice, she told the children to leave me alone. Her stomach is still empty, she said, putting her arm around my waist. She led me to the hearth in her hut. Making sure not to step on or collide with any of the aluminum and enamel cooking pots acquired through trade with other settlements, the tortoiseshells, gourds, and baskets scattered on the ground, I sat across from Hayama. I extended my legs fully in the way of the Itti Kotteri women, and scratching the head of her pet parrot, I waited for the food. Eat, she said, handing me a baked plantain on a broken calabash. Attentively, the old woman watched as I chewed with my mouth open, smacking my lips repeatedly. She smiled, content that I was fully appreciating the soft, sweet plantain. Hayama had been introduced to me by Milagros as Angelica's sister. Every time I looked at her, I tried to find some resemblance to the frail old woman I had lost in the forest. About 5'4", Hayama was tall for an Itti Kotteri woman. Not only was she physically different from Angelica, but she did not have her sister's lightness of spirit. There was a harshness to Hayama's voice and manner that often made me feel uncomfortable. And her heavy drooping eyelids gave her face a peculiarly sinister expression. "You stay here with me until Milagros returns," the old woman said, serving me another baked plantain. I stuffed the hot fruit in my mouth so I would not have to answer. Milagros had introduced me to his brother-in-law, Arasue, who was the head man of the Itti Kotteri, as well as to the other members of the settlement. However, it was Ritimi who, by hanging my hammock in the hut she shared with Itua and their 2 children, had made it known that I belonged to her. "The white girl sleeps here," she had said to Milagros, explaining that little Tishoma and Sisiwe would have their hammocks hung around Tutemi's hearth in the adjoining hut. No one had interfered with Ritimi's scheme. Silently, a smile of gentle mockery on his face, Itua had watched as Ritimi rushed between their hut and Tutemi's, rearranging the hammocks in the customary triangle around the fire. On a small loft built between the back poles supporting the dwelling, she placed my knapsack amidst bark boxes, an assortment of baskets, an axe, and gourds with onoto seeds and roots. Ritime's self-assuredness stemmed not only from the fact that she was the head man, Arasue's oldest daughter, by his first wife, a daughter of old Hayama, now dead, and that she was Itua's first and favorite wife, but also because Ritimi knew that in spite of her quick temper, everyone in the Shabono respected and liked her. No more, I pleaded with Hayama as she took another plantain from the fire. My belly is full. Pulling up my t-shirt, I pushed out my stomach so she could see how filled it looked. You need to grow fat around your bones, the old woman said, mashing up the banana with her fingers. Your breasts are as small as a child's. Giggling, she pulled my t-shirt up further. No man will ever want you. He'll be afraid to hurt himself on the bones. Opening my eyes wide in mock horror, I pretended to gobble down the mush. I'll surely get fat and beautiful eating your food, I said with my mouth full. Still wet from her river bath, Ritimi came into the hut, combing her hair with a densely thistled pod. Sitting next to me, she put her arms around my neck and planted resounding kisses on my face. I had to restrain myself from laughing. The Itti Kotteri kisses tickled me. They kissed differently. Each time they put their mouth against my cheek and neck, they vibrated their lips while sonorously ejecting air. You are not moving the white girl's hammock in here, Ritimi said, looking at her grandmother. The certainty of her tone was not matched by the inquiring softness of her dark eyes. Not wanting to be the cause of an argument, I made it clear that it did not make much difference where my hammock hung. Since there were no walls between the huts, we practically lived together. Hayama's hut stood on Tutemi's left, and on our right was Arasue, the headman's, which he shared with his oldest wife and 3 of his smallest children. His other 2 wives and their respective offspring occupied adjacent huts. Ritimi fixed her gaze on me, a pleading expression in her eyes. Milagros asked me to take care of you, she said, running the thistled pod through my hair, softly, so as not to scratch my scalp. After what seemed an interminable silence, Hayama finally said, You can leave your hammock where it is, but you will eat here with me. It was a good arrangement, I thought. Itti already had 4 mouths to feed. Hayama, on the other hand, was taking good care of her youngest son. Judging by the amount of animal skulls and plantains hanging from the thatched palm roof, her son was a good hunter and cultivator. Other than the baked plantains eaten in the morning, there was only one meal in the late afternoon, when families gathered together to eat. People snacked throughout the day on whatever was available, fruit, nuts, or such delicacies as roasted ants and grubs. Ritimi also seemed pleased with the eating arrangement. Smiling, she walked over to our hut, pulled down the basket she had given me, which was hanging above my hammock, then took out my notepad and pencil. Now, let us work, she said in a commanding tone. In the days that followed, Ritimi taught me about her people as Milagros had done for the past 6 months. He had set up a few hours each day for what I referred to as formal instruction. At first, I had great difficulty in learning the language. Not only did I find it to be heavily nasal, but it was extremely difficult to understand people when they talked with wads of tobacco in their mouths. I tried to devise some sort of comparative grammar, but gave it up when I realized that not only did I not have the proper linguistic training, but the more I tried to be rational about learning their language, the less I could speak. My best teachers were the children. Although they pointed things out to me and greatly enjoyed giving me words to repeat, they made no conscious effort to explain anything. With them, I was able to rattle on, totally uninhibited about making mistakes. After Milagro's departure, there was still much I did not comprehend. Yet I was astonished by how well I managed to communicate with others, reading correctly the inflection of their voices, the expression on their faces, and the eloquent movements of their hands and bodies. During those hours of formal instruction, Ritimi took me to visit the women in the different huts, and I was allowed to ask questions to my heart's content. Baffled by my curiosity, the women talked freely, as if they were playing a game. They patiently explained, again and again, whatever I did not understand. I was grateful Milagros had set the precedent. Not only was curiosity regarded as bad manners, but it went against their will to be questioned. Yet Milagros had lavishly indulged me in what he called my eccentric whim, stating that the more I knew about the language and customs of the Itti Kotteri, the quicker I would feel at home with them. It soon became apparent that I did not need to ask too many direct questions. Often the most casual remark on my part was reciprocated by a flow of information I would not have dreamed of eliciting. Each day, just before nightfall, aided by Ritimi and Tutemi, I would go over the data gathered during the day and try to order it under some kind of classificatory scheme, such as social structure, cultural values, subsistence techniques, and other universal categories of human social behavior. However, to my great disappointment, there was one subject Milagros had not touched upon: shamanism. I had observed from my hammock 2 curing sessions, of which I had written detailed accounts. Arasue is a great shapori, Milagros had said to me as I watched my first curing ritual. Does he invoke the help of the spirits when he chants? I asked as I watched Milagros' brother-in-law massage, suck, and rub the prostrate body of a child. Milagros had given me an outraged look. There are things one doesn't talk about. He had gotten up abruptly, and before walking out of the hut, had added, "Don't ask about these things. If you do, you will run into serious trouble." I had not been surprised by his response, but I had been unprepared for his outright anger. I wondered if his refusal to talk about the subject was because I was a woman, or rather, that shamanism was a taboo topic. I did not dare to find out at that time. Being a woman, white, and alone was precarious enough. I was aware that in most societies, knowledge regarding shamanistic and curing practices are never revealed except to the initiates. During Milagro's absence, I did not mention the word shamanism once, but spent hours deliberating over what would be the best way to learn about it without arousing any anger and suspicion. From my notes on the 2 sessions, it became evident that the Itti Kotteri believed the Shapori's body underwent a change when under the influence of the hallucinogenic snuff, Ipina. That is, the shaman acted under the assumption that his human body transformed itself into a supernatural body. Thus, he made contact with the spirits in the forest. My obvious approach would be to arrive at an understanding of shamanism via the body, not as an object determined by psychochemical laws, holistic forces in nature, the environment, or the psyche itself, but through an understanding of the body as lived experience. The body as an expressive unity known through performance. Most studies on shamanism, including mine, have focused on the psychotherapeutic and social aspects of healing. I thought that my approach would not only provide a novel explanation, but would furnish me with a way of learning about curing without becoming suspect. Questions concerning the body need not necessarily be associated with shamanism. I had no doubt that little by little, I would retrieve the necessary data without the Itti Kotteri ever being aware of what I was really after. Any pangs of conscience I felt regarding the dishonesty of my task were quickly stilled by repeating to myself that my work was important for the understanding of non-Western healing practices. The strange, often bizarre customs of shamanism would become understandable in the light of a different interpretational context, thus furthering anthropological knowledge in general. "You haven't worked for 2 days," Ritimi said to me one afternoon. "You haven't asked about last night's songs and dances. Don't you know they are important? If we don't sing and dance, the hunters will return without meat for the feast." Scowling, she threw the notepad into my lap. "You haven't even painted in your book." "I'm resting for a few days," I said, clutching the notepad against my breast, as if it were the dearest thing I possessed. I had no intention of letting her know that every precious page was to be filled exclusively with data on shamanism. Ritimi took my hands in hers, examined them intently. Then, assuming a very serious expression, commented, "They look very tired. They need rest." We burst out laughing. Ritimi had always been baffled that I considered decorating my book to be work. To her, work meant digging weeds in the garden, collecting firewood, and repairing the roof of the Shabono. "I liked the dances and songs very much," I said. "I recognized your voice. It was beautiful." Ritimi beamed at me. "I sing very well." There was a charming candor and assurance in her statement. She was not boasting, but only stating a fact. I'm sure the hunters will return with plenty of game to feed the guests at the feast. Nodding in agreement, I looked for a twig, then began to sketch a human figure on the soft dirt. This is the body of a white person, I said as I sketched the main organs and bones. I wonder how the body of an Itti Kotteri looks. You must be very tired to ask such a stupid question, Ritimi said, staring at me as if I were dim-witted. She stood up and began to dance, chanting in a loud, melodious voice. This is my head. This is my arm. This is my breast. This is my stomach. This is my... In no time at all, attracted by Ritimi's antics, a group of women and men gathered around us. Squealing and laughing, they made obscene remarks about each other's bodies. Some of the adolescent boys were laughing so hard they rolled on the ground, holding their penises. Can anyone draw a body the way I drew mine? I asked. Several responded to this challenge. Grabbing a piece of wood, a twig, or a broken bow, they began to draw on the dirt. Their drawings differed markedly from each other's, not only because of the obvious sexual differences, which they made sure to emphasize, but because all the men's bodies were depicted with tiny figures inside the chest. I could hardly hide my delight. I thought, these must be the spirits I had heard Arasue summon with his chant before he began the curing session. What are these? I asked casually. The Hekuras of the forest who live in a man's chest, one of the men said. Are all men Shapori? All men have Hekuras in their chests, the man said. But only a real Shapori can make use of them. Only a great Shapori can command his Hekuras to aid the sick and counteract the spells of enemy Shapori. Studying my sketch, he asked, why does your picture have Hekuras? Even in the legs, women don't have Hekuras. I explained that these were not spirits, but organs and bones, and they promptly added them to their own drawings. Content with what I had learned, I willingly accompanied Ritimi to gather firewood in the forest, the women's most arduous and unwelcome task. They could never get enough wood, for the fires were never allowed to die. That evening, as she had done every night since I arrived at the settlement, Ritimi examined my feet for thorns and splinters. Satisfied that there were none, she rubbed them clean with her hands. I wonder if the bodies of the Shapori go through some kind of transformation when they are under the influence of Ipina, I said. It was important to have it confirmed in their own words, since the original premise of my theoretical scheme was that the shaman operated under certain assumptions concerning the body. I needed to know if these assumptions were shared by the group and if they were a conscious or unconscious nature. Did you see Iramamoe yesterday? Ritimi asked. Did you see him walk? His feet didn't touch the ground. He is a powerful Shapori. He became the great jaguar. He didn't cure anyone, I said glumly. It disappointed me that Arasue's brother was considered a great shaman. I had seen him beat his wife on 2 occasions. No longer interested in pursuing the conversation, Ritimi turned away from me and began to get ready for our evening ritual. Lifting the basket that held my belongings from the small loft at the back of the hut, she placed it on the ground. One by one, she took out each item and held it above her head, waiting for me to identify it. As soon as I did, she repeated the name in Spanish, then in English, starting a nocturnal chorus as the headman's wives and several other women who each night gathered in our hut echoed the foreign words. I relaxed in my hammock as Tutemi's fingers parted my hair, searching for imaginary lice. I was certain I did not have any. Not yet. Tutemi appeared to be 5 or 6 years younger than Ritime, whom I believed to be 20. She was taller and heavier, her stomach round with her first pregnancy. She was shy and retiring. Often I had discovered a sad, faraway look in her dark eyes, and at times she talked to herself as if she were thinking aloud. Lice! Lice! Tutemi shouted, interrupting the woman's Spanish-English chant. Let me see, I said, convinced that she was joking. Are lice white? I asked, examining the tiny white bugs on her finger. I had always believed they were dark. White girl, white lice, Tutemi said mischievously. With gleeful delight, she crunched them one by one between her teeth and swallowed them. All lice are white,